my dad was the first Oromo person to migrate to Australia in the history of the country to live.
And so at the end of a bayonet, my father was forced out of Palestine in what's called the Nakba.
There's a lot of parallels between South Africa and Israel today.
Little did I realise that would lead me onto things I didn't imagine beyond my wildest dreams.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Oh Allah, we ask for your blessing of this amazing gathering. Today we are joined by an amazing sister. Toltu here is with us for another Safi Bros podcast. Yeah. But before we introduce her, I would like to welcome you all, and I would like to tell you all, inshallah, we are available on all the platforms, including YouTube, every second Friday at 3 p.m. So please subscribe so you can get each episode ASAP. We now would like to welcome Toltu Tufa, a multilingual psychologist, author, and at the moment a sexual educator.
That's
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Safi Bros podcast.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's really good to be here.
How did the last one come about? That's what I want to know.
Yeah, it's
like,
so
looking at all those, mashallah.
Yeah.
How did that last one come about? That's what I want to know. Let's start there, I reckon.
That's an interesting one. It's probably the most recent turn that I've made in some ways. But look, I am a practicing psychologist and I do focus a lot on sexual education, particularly among Muslim parents and Muslim communities and Muslim schools. And where it started was actually about 20 years ago before I became a psychologist. So I was involved in program writing. So I'd write programs for schools and they got me to write sexual assault prevention programs for secondary schools. And I loved it and it was amazing. And not only did I learn to do it, but I implemented it. I got schools to admit they had an issue, implement it. I trained police, I trained professionals to do it. I won government awards. And subhanAllah, one of the interesting things that happened was I said, this would be great for Muslim schools. And it was a flat no. Nobody wanted to work with Muslims and Catholics. And the reason was simple. They're like, these people don't believe in sex before marriage. These people preach abstinence. We're not going to ruin the integrity, of what we're looking to do by watering down our message. And I thought, I'm Muslim. You don't have to water the message down. Like there's a cultural element to it, but you don't have to do that. And look, I was at the bottom of the pecking order, so I kind of let it be. Oh. And then years and years later, I became a psychologist. I started working with victim survivors, of sexual abuse and sexual assault, as psychologists do work with trauma.
Why that?
To be honest, I wasn't focused on that in particular, but it was one of the areas that, people come to treat me for. So I spent nearly 17 years in training. It was 8 years, but it took me 17. Wow. And I eventually started to be able to treat very complex trauma cases. When I moved into specialization, I ended up specializing in working with people who've been convicted of sexually harming others. So that's a very specific niche area. And so I learned how to assess and treat these people. So assessing this is not before they were found guilty. This is once everything's been done. They've been found guilty and they're doing either a sentence or a community order. I would be asked, what is the risk of this person likely to reoffend again? Wow. So my role would be to determine risk. Wow. And then based on that, determine what their treatment dosage was and then provide the treatment. So,
and predominantly male?
It's definitely predominantly male. There are also women, not very many, but predominantly it is a gendered crime for the most part. So it's usually men. And so, subhanAllah, what happened was I ended up, working in all these different areas. So in the prevention space, the victim survivor space, the perpetrating space. And then as a Muslim woman of color, I saw a parenting coach. Can we name drop here? So Coach Mesa, I was watching her and I just replied to one of her messages because she spoke about it. And then she said, do you want to do a reel? And so, subhanAllah, I wrote the script. We did it in a day. And then, boom, it just went like wildfire. And long story short, since then, what I thought was natural and normal, and everybody knows this, apparently people don't know. So I started working, presenting at Islamic conferences, and schools have been lining up saying, can you come in? Can we have you speak? And so what I'm really excited about is getting parents confident to speak to their children, not just about sex, but it's sexual education. So all the building blocks that lead to it, so that we don't have stories of, horrific cases where, women describe where they didn't know what puberty was until they got their, they were started to menstruate, and men saying we had no idea what to do because it was never spoken about in primary school, high school, or with parents. So hence the final label.
Give us a case that really stands out for you that's, quite hard hitting.
I guess probably the most hard-hitting cases that I've dealt with in terms of people who've engaged in sexually harming other people is two. One is hearing about their own stories and histories, and sometimes finding out how they came to be what it is. So the interviews can be quite long, can be up to 6 hours long at a time. So maybe not in one go, but we really get down to what is it that led this person to be in this place in the first place? And for a lot of people, it's the first time they've spoken about it because there's so much shame around it. People don't often speak about their experiences. And so when someone's coming in after all the lights have gone down and everyone's gone away and you're just kind of trying to live your life, that's the time where you start to find out about people's stories. And I think it just brings a level of understanding that I think I never had before. And the second one is that what a lot of people don't realize, I could do a whole podcast on this, is that there are a number of people with disabilities who can also be convicted of sexually harming others. And so that's something that we're not always aware of, and sometimes they don't realize they're doing something wrong as well. Wow. And so, ignorance is no excuse. It's like the drink driving. Like if you harm other people, there are consequences for it. So obviously the treatment for people who have disabilities or who may not have the cognitive capacity to understand can be really sometimes sad, but also recognising that people with disabilities are also very vulnerable to abuse. So it's a bit of both, and it doesn't mean that people who have disabilities move on to sexually harm people. That's not true, but there is a cohort of people who do that, and that can be quite intense when you realise what people's situations are.
Have you ever been attacked while doing these courses?
Never. And so, subhanAllah, as a psychologist, I've worked in a lot of forensic spaces, not just sexual crimes, but family violence and general crime as well. And I've never, ever been attacked, ever.
Alhamdulillah.
And for the most part, it's people like, is it scary sitting in front of someone who's like a psychopath?
There's priors. There's priors there. So
100%. And I think it's really important with people that expectations are made super clear. And I think that's the best way to have a conversation. Often, as a psychologist, the first question I usually ask when I'm sitting in front of someone is, do you know why I'm here? Do you have an understanding of what this is about today? And so one of the cornerstones of being a good psychologist is teaching the concept of consent. So explaining to them about, this is where your information is going to go. This is where your information is not going to go. Here's where you have power, so you can choose what it is that you want to share with me. This is what I'm going to do with your information. So when they hear that, they know where we're going with it. And then if they choose not to answer a question, I always talk about power dynamics. Like, I want to be free to ask you whatever I like, and you should be free to say, well, I don't want to answer that. And that's something that we navigate, that resistance as well.
But how do you go on going back to home and hearing these horrific stories and situations? How do you go back to say,
normal life?
Normal life. Like how do you keep yourself grounded that way? Like, is faith? What is it? What is it that's actually how do you not look at every man thinking, this guy might be the next victim or?
Yeah, and I think that's something, honestly, a lot of parents experience. So when, we know in Australia, the facts and statistics on sexual abuse is that 1 in 3 women before the age of 16 will experience abuse, and 1 in 5 males will experience abuse before the age of 16. So we're talking about, and often it's people that relatives, coaches, trusted people. So parents often have this fear saying, well, how do we get our children to pick out the predator? And you don't. That's what you don't do. There are ways to teach your children just how to create a norm or a cultural expectation within your family to protect your children. And so it's so important as psychologists, because this is our bread and butter, that we also see psychologists. So a psychologist will always see another psychologist to debrief and to work. I see 5. I have 5 different psychologists that I see. So
Wow.
on average, once a week, I'm seeing someone. Sometimes I see them to help me case formulate, to understand like, why is this happening? Is there a better way I can understand and treat this? Sometimes I see psychologists just to offload and be like, this is everything that's going on. And then sometimes I see a psychologist personally for me, like I need one. Then I have another one that I see to help me with my business. And there's this psychological concept that I love, which is called motivational interviewing. And the idea is it's a skill that you use to help people be motivated to make change and to work through resistance. So when people are resistant, so we're talking about addictions and crimes and things like that, how can we have a conversation where they're actually talking to you rather than, holding walls up? So one of the country's best trainers in that is someone that I often go to for help, and she's wonderful.
Amazing. SubhanAllah.
So yeah, I don't like to take anything home really. I don't take very much home at all.
Oh, wow.
I spoke to a psychologist. I took a friend there.
Yeah.
And he's a Muslim brother.
Yeah.
And subhanAllah, I go to him. I asked him the same question that he just asked you. And he goes to me, he pointed down to his shoes. And I go, what do you mean? He goes, when these shoes are on, I'm a psychologist.
Right.
When these shoes are off, I am me.
Right.
So he associates with it's amazing. And I thought that was amazing. It's like putting a hat on.
Yeah.
So I thought that was quite amazing how he sort of says, if I'm not wearing these shoes, I'm no longer a psychologist. I'm just me.
Okay.
So this is how I dissociate myself from being a psychologist.
Right.
And subhanAllah, which is amazing. I never thought of that concept, but
Like a uniform kind of.
it's like a uniform. I've got
I'm
the
a police officer.
And now I'm dad.
yeah, it's amazing. SubhanAllah, it's different people do different things. Yeah, isn't it amazing?
I think so. I think for me, there's a phenomenon in Islamic psychology is that there's this idea, and Dr. Abdullah Rothman talks to this concept. So he's sort of doing a lot of pioneering work in it. And one of the things he talks about is, quite often when psychologists talk to people to help them, they help you from a view, a horizontal view that life begins here and life ends here, and you need to manage everything in between that. Whereas, Islamic psychology, understanding how we work, is that we're not actually people at the end of the day, we're souls. And our soul's journeys is a lot more further out than birth and death, which is only just part of what we have. We have the whole, post-death and pre-birth. And so understanding, when you're able to, without reducing or minimizing anything, when you accept things for what they are and then able to take a step back and look at the breadth of what your soul's journey is, it can be easier to think of a different perspective, particularly when you think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you just being a vessel for him.
SubhanAllah, mashallah.
SubhanAllah, it's amazing.
Okay, let's roll back now. Let's roll back. Roll back to when you were young, and so you were born here in Australia?
That's right. I was born in Australia to a Turkish mother and an Oromo father. So my father's Oromo from East Africa, where people would know as Ethiopia, but he refers to himself as Oromo. They met in the 80s when it wasn't fashionable to be having cross-cultural marriages, and they had me. I was their firstborn daughter back in the 80s.
Dad's from Africa?
Yep.
And mum met here in Australia?
Yep.
Or they met
they met here. Believe it or not, my grandfather was involved in orchestrating this relationship, which is weird because he was, Allah yarhamah, he was so strict with my mum and siblings on so many things except marriage.
Wow.
That was the only thing. He was like, never run away. Like, if he's Muslim, we'll make it work. And then he recommended my dad for my mum, which the Turkish community at the time was not happy about.
Wow. Yeah. The Turks are very patriot. They bleed red.
I think, literally in every sense of the word. And I think, so mum and dad got married. And because my grandparents were around, I ended up living with them for 9 years of my life. So I became really exposed to the Turkish language, the Turkish culture, the Turkish people. They spoke no English. So I learned everything like a Turkish person would growing up.
Wow.
Yeah. Growing up with grandparents, completely different, isn't it? Like culturally, how does it affect you?
I think, and I didn't realize this as a child, but I'm looking back because I'm a parent now. Raising kids is stressful. Grandparents tend to enjoy it more because they don't have the responsibility.
Yes.
I loved my grandparents. They were awesome. My granddad took me out. Actually, he did some things that were quite scary. So back in the day, we didn't have to wear seatbelts. So he would go like to the sheep market and he'd put the sheep in the back and I'd be in the front on the floor and we'd be staring eye to eye with one another. I'd be petrified for my life. My grandma taught me about all the different foods and how to make, so I can make all the Turkish delicacies. I know this doesn't allude, this exterior doesn't show it, but I know how to make all the traditional Turkish delicacies and food because I lived with her for 9 years, because I learned how to wrap the vine leaves, because I learned how to roll out dough. I learned how to make baklava and manta and all of this stuff because I had my grandma.
Manta.
Yes. And so what happened was if anything, the most conflict I had was not with my grandparents, but it was with everyone else living in the house because privacy didn't exist. So we were 21 people in a household.
Wow.
We had 7 bedrooms. My granddad's home, we lived in his home. And so he was all about, you know how like ethnics are like, come in, save your deposit money, then go buy a house. We were doing that for 9 years. Not quite actually, but essentially that's what I learned from them. I learned the language, I learned the culture, and I learned something that someone Oromo asked me when I was publishing my books. They said, why do you make books for Oromo people and not for Turkish people? Why don't you do something with your mother's community instead of us? Why did you choose us? And I had to think about that. And the reason I think is because, the political context of Turkish people is very different to the context of the Oromo people. As Oromos, our identity was contested. I could not be Oromo. I'd be like, why would a beautiful girl like you speak such a language? People would say to me, you don't look Oromo. Definitely not. Like people would have, or, you're not allowed to speak, or you're not allowed to live if you speak that language. Whereas the Turkish background had nothing about their identity was contested. If you come to the northern suburbs of Melbourne, you'll see that they're all about, here. So they have this sense of privilege, I think is probably a privilege that they had, that they've never been like overtaken. They've never been, one to have one up. Like if anything, they have a sense of a different attitude towards, their identity. So I feel like being raised in a house where I had both, I was able to appreciate the entitlement that came with being Turkish of I deserve to be who I am. Who are you to tell me that I can't speak that language?
I can imagine we grew up with a lot of Turkish brothers and they're very patriot. And not only that, like I can imagine some situations, you being in Turkish gatherings and these Turks speaking behind your back.
I have no idea.
And you pulling a woolly on them. Can you give us an situation?
There was a couple actually. So one was I was on an escalator at a shopping centre and this lady was commenting on how nice my hijab was. And she was like, her scarf, in Turkish, her scarf looks really nice. I wonder where she bought it from. I don't know. They started having a conversation. I turned around, I'm like, actually, in Turkish, I said, I bought it from Spotlight, and then back in the day it was fashionable to use candle wax to do the edging.
That's right.
And I was like,
that.
yeah. So I said, I got it from Spotlight, and this is the name of the material, and I used to use candles to do the edging, and there was just no reaction. We were on an escalator. We had to get off.
You're not Turkish.
No, I don't think the woman even comprehended. Like she just couldn't comprehend between the two. So that was a real positive one. There have been negative ones too, where I've had people say super racist comments to me, or to people around me, or to my relatives and family. Really nasty stuff. And then I'll just wait till they finish. And I'll be like, "Are you done yet? Is there anything else that you'd like to say?" And they'll be like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Please forgive me."
Have you ever been to Turkey?
Yeah, I've been a few times and I feel like I know my mum's family better than my mum. I get along with them really well.
Oh, wow.
So I've been to where my mum was born, where she was raised, her village, and I'm really good friends with all of her relatives.
Did it take you said your grandparents were open for your dad to.
Yep.
Usually that's isn't the norm.
No. The reaction of the Turkish community at the time was they spat in his face.
Wow.
Yeah, they said, how could you give your beautiful young daughter to a black man like him?
Wow.
And my
mum and dad, your grandparents were okay.
My grandma was a bit funny, if I'm being totally honest. She was like, what if he takes her and never comes back? That was her big fear. And my granddad was like, when was the last time you saw your mum? She was like, 20 years. He's like, so it's not the country that matters. Like, and ironically, from all of my grandma's children, my mum has been the one who's always lived and stayed the closest to my grandma.
Allah.
And my father was the longest surviving son-in-law too.
Wow.
Still around. And so they get along quite well. And so sometimes, we bring in our own, biases towards the situation, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has other plans.
Allah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Allahu Akbar.
We were blessed.
Allah.
Some wild and crazy stories. But look, when I go to Turkey as well, people, in Turkey,
imagine, yeah.
in Turkey, depending on where you are, sometimes they're not surprised. If it's like Istanbul, what they are surprised is at my accent or my fluency. So I was like, oh, where did you learn to speak Turkish? So the questions would be a bit different because you're not from here. Because I'm not from here. Well, then how do you learn to speak? Well, because I lived in a Turkish house for 9 years. Yeah.
When I was in Turkey, I had that. So I can understand more than I can speak because I hung around with a lot of Turks.
That makes
I
sense.
tell them, teach me the words and I'll teach you Arabic. But of course the Turks said, we don't want to learn Arabic. So I go, I'll learn Turkish. So when I was in Turkey, people thought I was Kıbrıslı.
Oh, actually, yeah, you could pass.
You know what I mean? So 100%. When because I had to get around, so I had to, get the words together. And I understood them more than I can comprehend. Like I can comprehend what they say, but they can't less than me speaking back to them. Alhamdulillah, it's amazing. It's amazing when you communicate.
And when it comes to language learning, like, and people always say, oh, let me teach you the swear words or let me teach. I think the best words to learn in a new language is responding to conversations. Like the first word you should learn in every language is, oh, really? That's the first word you should learn because that's all you need to say to people. And they're like, how much of this did they understand? And no one really knows.
I use this word a lot, chamarma.
Yeah. Which means don't be a smart aleck, basically. That's what you're saying. Yeah. Or you could do another variation of that, which is it can be kind of rude. It's more like street talk. But so you know the word banana?
Yeah.
So you say banane instead of banana. Can you say banane means I don't care? Oh. And if you swap it and say sanane, that means what's it to you?
Yeah. Oh, banane.
Banane. I've used those, yeah.
That's the only word that I learned in Italian. It was banana. I did Italian for 3 years. Part of my schooling.
I definitely have views on language learning for sure. Like, in Australia we do this whole, you have to learn a language for 6 years and you learn it for 3 years and you only learn one Italian word. Yeah. I think we should be learning Auslan. I feel like Australia should learn sign language because there's so many different languages everywhere.
Amazing.
I feel like if we did sign language, that'd be awesome.
I read a study that showed that the more languages you learn, the higher IQ level because subhanAllah, you exercising parts of your brain that you never exercise, especially when you go. Linguistics is such a powerful thing, learning multiple languages. Even Einstein knew multiple languages, subhanAllah. It's so powerful.
But look at yourselves, like even with the language you speak, if you can speak another language, just the way you communicate, there are some words where no matter how fluent you are in English, you switch because you really want to get that point across. And so imagine having that in like multiple languages. The fact you can do it between two languages, you already have an understanding of how it can be done in other languages too. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Konuşuyorum Turkish.
Öyle mi? Maşallah çok iyi konuşuyorsunuz.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Maşallah. Öğrenmişsin ya. Belli zaten para sayıyorsun. I mean, you count money, that's why you know numbers.
Çok para.
I like that. I don't speak Turkish.
Inshallah, yeah. So I learnt Turkish that way and then I learned how to speak Oromo from my dad, only from him. Nobody else. There were my dad was the first Oromo person to migrate to Australia in the history of the country to live. So he arrived first and then he sent message back and tell whatever they had back in those days and said this country is not bad. And then a few weeks later people started to follow. So he was based in Egypt actually. He lived in Egypt for nearly a decade studying and and then had an opportunity to come to Australia. And back in those days, back in the mid-80s, remember how Ethiopia was like the famine and we've got to save them all? Yeah. Dad was like, there were camera crews for us at the airport. Like they were celebrities and he didn't know why. And then they, moved to this, hostile area. And so at the time, there was a lot of conflict in Ethiopia. So the language at the time was banned by law for 100 years until 1991. So people weren't allowed to speak the language. Can you imagine if someone just said, we're not speaking English anymore, we now speak, I don't know, Turkish? Like what would happen to your work? What would happen to your jobs? What would happen to your lifestyle? It'd be really difficult.
Overnight.
Yeah, they did it through genocide, but yeah, that's basically what happened. And then it got put into law until 1991. So at that time, as a child growing up, I learnt this language that I thought was a secret language that no one really knew except my dad and his friends.
SubhanAllah.
So you were proficient in it?
I was proficient in it. He taught all of us, all of my siblings, before we went to school. We all learnt the language. And then he said, if you forget it after that, I've done my responsibility. It's not on me anymore. But I think for Dad, you know, when you have migrant refugee backgrounds and you experience conflict, sometimes, you know, your sense of home can't be your country. You know, if you look at some of the things that are happening in the world right now, people are being forced off their lands, people are being forced off their identity. So you start to learn to make other things your sense of home. And for Dad, it was language. Language was his sense of home, like the way food might be a sense of home for people. So language was important. And he taught it to us. Little did I realize that would lead me on to things I didn't imagine beyond my wildest dreams. So the ban was eventually lifted. And then I started making children's content for Saturday schools, teaching the language. I didn't speak the language perfectly, to be honest. But they said, listen, you were born and raised here. The kids will listen to you. You teach them. And so I did. And then
How old were you then?
I was 12.
Wow.
I was 12 when I started. I had no idea what I was doing. But by the time I was 15 or 16, I started creating worksheets. And, you know, there were 4 other Oromo schools by this point, and then they wanted the worksheets. And then I thought, this was when social media started. So I was like, why don't I just post this online and say, you know, it's my dream to make a book for every Oromo child in every family, in every home. And wallahi, within an hour, I had 500 likes. This was like 20 years ago. That was huge. 10 years ago, sorry. And so from there, what I said was, okay, I created a video, documented my story, and I said to the world, in the next month, I need money. If you want to fundraise, I need $50,000 to make these products for kids. I know exactly what I'm doing. If you want to participate, let me know. If I don't make the money, I'll refund your money back and go back to my life. And in 4 weeks, 23 countries got in touch with me. We had fundraisers for about 12 different countries, and we raised 123,000 in 6 weeks. Alhamdulillah. So that was the beginning. So that went on, and then I made the books. Then I toured the top 5 countries who raised all the money. I documented all this. I evaluated my work. And people were, more than the books, they loved the fact that it was bringing people together. So finally, in 2018 it was, and you know, times have changed since then, but the person who became the government was Oromo, who became the prime minister of the country, became an Oromo person. And so, you know, this was like a tear-jerking kind of moment for so many people, because he went around at the time to other countries apologizing for what had happened and invited people back home. So people were like gobsmacked. And so he said, we're going to do our Thanksgiving ceremony, which we have as Oromo people. This year it will be in the capital city of the country. And 7 million people showed up to the capital city. And I was one of the guests that was invited. So it was a talk about, like, you know, full circle moment. Yeah.
Dad's not around?
He is around.
So he
I took him with me.
Amazing.
I took him with me. He burst into tears. I was crying the whole time. But I think he was just overwhelmed. And so, you know, we were treated as guests of honor. And so Dad was the real guest, the real OG. I was the one who did the work, but people were saying, you raised, you know, this daughter. And he's like, I did not plan it. Like, it wasn't in his plan.
SubhanAllah.
So, yeah, things went downhill pretty quickly in East Africa politics. But at least, alhamdulillah, we achieved what we wanted to.
SubhanAllah. Something so small can be so...
And I think that's the thing. A lot of people, like when I was growing up, when I was 12 years old, honestly, I didn't know what I wanted to become. When I was 21, I still didn't know what I wanted to become. And I think for me, the most powerful thing I learned was the power of volunteering, the power of serving your community. Because when you start working for free, people are not comfortable with that. They feel the need to teach you something, to learn something, to bring you along, and to give you the knowledge that you would never get with money. So I saw, I heard, I learnt so many things that by the time it came to running Afaan Publications, which was, you know, in my 20s, I started when I was 12. I had 12 years of experience up my sleeve. I learnt how to deal with objection handling, people management, prioritization, timelines, project management. I knew how to do all of that, and I just did it because, you know, what happens is, and And then interestingly, like TED Talks was interested in what I did. So they asked me to do a TED Talk on my whole experience. And part of it is honestly, like as young people, you have things that the world doesn't have. And people don't realize that, like relatively, young people have a lot of time. They don't have a lot of money. It's like adults. They got money. They don't have time,
That's right.
So we need to leverage what you don't have with what you have. So I had time. I didn't have money. So I got people to give me money. And I created ways for people to give. And they did. And they're still willing to give. And then, what I did was I said, okay, I know how to speak Oromo, but I'm no perfect professional. I'm no professor. So I didn't have the language skills, but I got people who knew about the language to come and edit all the work that I did. So all my stuff was for kids. Basics, A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, but in Oromo says it was like mind-blowing. And so what I couldn't believe was how willing people were to give. When you give, I feel like for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, things come back to you, not one, not two, but multifold. And so people would ask, like, why do you do this whole language thing? Like, what's your agenda? And I would tell people it's a religious agenda, but I never, and you will never find anything religious in any of my books because I don't like to, preach to people because there are separate religions among Oromo people. Wow. But the fact that Allah created us into nations and tribes so that we may know one another, to me indicates that language that tried to be banned, upholding it is an act of worship. So upholding that language, upholding your language with your children, having your children to communicate, with their family, that sense of culture, that is an act of worship that Allah will literally reward you for every word you utter. So I was very excited to do the Oromo work, regardless of, for Muslims or otherwise.
Too. SubhanAllah.
Yeah. I was supported to make mistakes. That's how it happened. If I wasn't, probably because no one really knew or cared about me in terms of who I was a nobody. So they were like, yeah, teach the kids, do what you want. Who really cares? And then it's all the volunteering that kind of fell into place. I was the poorest financial one out of my friends. I made the least money. They all got into work. I was the one volunteering for everything. I just did what I liked. And then subhanAllah, it's like the saying, the arrow, you shoot back, and when the arrow shoots, it just straight forward. Yeah, you don't make 100 grand in 6 weeks. I did. I can make even more money than that if I wanted to.
SubhanAllah. So subhanAllah, mashallah, what a journey. What a journey. Like, I think one for me, like, Turkish and Africa clash, amazing, and you supporting that is amazing. Yeah. Can you take us to some really huge roadblocks you had going through that sort of journey of, your book or getting into that sort of world of writing?
I never considered myself as a writer, and a lot of my published books are for children, so it's quite simple. But what happened was at the time when the language ban was lifted, everyone was doing stuff for adults. So history books, PhDs. No one was doing anything for children. And so I was like, that's the next generation. Like, if you're not getting them, what's the purpose of all of this stuff? And so what was interesting was that from within my community, and the Oromo people are very diverse, politically, religiously, financially, in every different shape and form. But what brought all of them together is language.
Wow.
So, Oromo people are very connected in that way. So my project was able to, all politicians were really happy with my project because I never had flags because I'm not into politics. I never put my religious stuff up. The characters are Muslim, Christian, and the Oromo traditional faith, all three. I don't sit there preaching Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not the space for it. It's just teaching children their language. My intention was religious, but in terms of the output, didn't have to be that way in my mind. The most difficult thing I encountered were people outside of the Oromo community. Particularly, you can imagine in Ethiopia, the people who'd colonized the Oromo people. So I had quite a lot of backlash. I've had Twitter tirades against me. I've had people contact places that I work to get them to fire me. I've had actually even the TED talk that I did, people had complained so much that the TED organizers actually asked me to send a transcript of everything with references for every single thing that I've said, which I did, because nothing I said was wrong. Nothing I said was factually incorrect. And then I had people who'd written newspaper articles about me contact me saying, I wrote this article about years ago, but all of a sudden it's blowing up on Twitter. Can you explain to me why people want to take you down? I don't know. Well, I knew who they were, but I never allowed things like that to stop me, because here's the thing. When I was growing up and went to a Muslim school, the only muhajjaba woman with hijab in VCE, I looked like nobody. I did not fit into any social circle, and people wanted me to take my scarf off. And I can take my scarf off very easy. Look, it's not a drama for me to take to be a non-hijabi and to just go around my life like that. Even within our faith, if you genuinely fear for your life, there are women who've stopped wearing it because they fear for their life. Let's say I took my scarf off, okay? What's next? Oh, the way my hair looks. Oh, it's not the right look. It's not long enough. It's not short enough. It's not straight enough. It's not curly enough. Then I've got to style my hair for what people are saying. And then what? Oh, then your skin color. That's a bit of a problem too. It's like it never ends. Like, who are you going to? It's like, oh, your beard. Oh, you shouldn't grow that beard. Or you shouldn't have that kind of hair. Don't straighten it. Like, don't curl it. Have it really straight. You keep changing and changing for people whose goalposts keep changing as well. And I think from a young age, I started to understand that if you don't stand up for anything, then anyone can take over you. So stand up for something you actually believe in. You might not know how to, but I think for a lot of people, even knowing what's important to them is half the battle.
Yeah.
SubhanAllah. Amazing, amazing.
Ahmed said that.
Yeah, he did.
Oh, did he? There you go. I copied it off him. It wasn't me. I don't want to take his words.
Stands for something or fall for everything or something like that.
Yeah. I think, that's right. He did say that. But, in my actual life, it's, if you just took off your scarf, your whole life problems will be solved. True, maybe, but other problems would come up. So what is it that I'm willing to compromise? And so even, for example, for women, for people who practice Islam differently to me, that's the other thing that really, as a psychologist, I see it a lot. Even with sexual education, you see different people on different spectrums of faith. And do you know what I learned? All of these people, like, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to us, or Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says to us, in his hadith, "Man yuridillahi bihi khayran yufaqihu fi din." When Allah intends to show you something good, He gives you understanding. Can you imagine? Do you know what that means? You don't want to be the person you were 10 years ago. You don't want to be this person who you are today in 10 years' time. You want to be changing. The fact that you've allowed yourself the audacity to change your Islamic views, where things you thought were haram before are now halal, or things that were halal before to you are now haram. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you that gift of understanding. And who are we to stop that gift from being given to others, that people are on their journey? And so I think, when you come from that place of compassion and understanding, people are a lot more open to have even the most trickiest of discussions.
Amazing. Why psychology? What took place there? So you went to non-Muslim high school?
Yep.
And how did you know you wanted to start picking the brain?
Well, for me, it was just super practical. As a Muslim woman, I was taught, by my community, society, even my family somewhat, not directly, but the most important day in my life was my wedding day. That's what I was taught for most women. The day you get married, that's what little kids are dreaming about, my wedding day, the dress. And so, being in year 10, thought, what do I want to be? Something that's going to work with a married life. So I wanted a job that I could do full-time or part-time. I wanted a job that wasn't in the office. I wanted a job that I could do, because a few of I could have done engineering, but I see like my friends being stuck in projects, working till midnight. I'm like, I want a family-friendly job. So also I didn't really want to go to uni. So I was like, what's the shortest degree you can do at a university? They're like, an arts degree. And I said, and what job do you get when you finish? Like, you don't get one. So what do you do? Yeah, I'm like, so what do you do? They said, but you could do psychology and go on to study. So, what I ended up doing was I did my arts degree, then I did my I did 2 postgraduate psychology degrees. I did a master's in education. I collected them like stamps after a while. From the girl who didn't want to be at uni to the one.
When did you leave the education world?
Probably 6 years ago, when I started fully practicing as a psychologist. And so even when I finished my VC and got ATARs, my dad was like, I said, I want to be a psychologist. And it's like, you know how people have problems in their stomachs, not in their heads? You should try becoming a doctor. That would be better for you, or a pharmacist or something like that. But I ended up doing psychology, which people thought was a nut job. You deal with crazy people only. But I think people now have an understanding. Our understanding of mental health is psychiatric. Whereas really it's about well-being. And so when you talk to people about things like afia or well-being, people are a lot more open to talk about not feeling 100% and so on. And psychology is not just about when things go wrong. It's about, you're perfecting to success and elite performance and achievement.
Have you felt like Muslims tend to go straight to the jinn and being possessed, and
Yeah. Yeah.
when it comes to
Let's get the sheikh to read out first before we see the psychologist.
Yeah.
do you feel that in your field and growth? What is your experience with that? Because
Yeah.
I'd love to hear a story.
I hate it as well. I don't have too many stories because I work in a forensic space.
Okay.
So for a lot of my career, I worked in the forensic area. So we often didn't deal with jinns. If someone said I did a crime because of a jinn, even I would be like, are you sure?
Okay.
No one's ever said that to me.
Okay.
So I haven't really dealt too much with jinns. But in terms of like the sexual education, I'm now becoming more privy to community. So I imagine maybe this stuff might be coming my way.
Oh wow.
Allah.
I wish I had a story for you though. Don't.
No, because that's every Muslim
Not a jinn
that
story.
deals with mental health or anything like that. They usually go straight to potentially he's possessed, potentially the sheikh has to read on him, potentially something's happening.
And I think it's quite arrogant of us as people to think that the only being is the human being. Like there are lots of other beings that exist, including things that we can't see. How we're able to communicate and engage with them, that's, I think science is still discovering it, but Muslims in some ways might have a bit of a shortcut.
Ameen, subhanAllah.
Yeah.
Can you take us to that sort of that proud moment? Would that proud moment, the proudest moment you've ever had,
Yeah.
would that be the time you received that award for your book, or could it be something even bigger?
Yeah, I think I'd like to say it was the birth of my children, but that was a traumatic experience. I was so stressed out when it happened, but alhamdulillah.
How many kids you have?
Two. So I've got a son and a daughter, and, you know, they are the apple of my eyes and I love them very much. But the day they were born was quite stressful. So that wasn't the best day of my life, I would say. The time in my life that I realized, okay, I think I've done something like this is not normal and just changed my life was when I created the products for Oromo children. And so the first thing I did was I made the letter A. And I did A is for Adu. Adu means son. And I made that and I showed it to my father. And I said, oh, Dad, I've done some books and like the alphabet, blah, blah. I want to show you a sample and see what you think. He's like, yeah, bring it. And I just showed it to him very flippantly. And he looked at it and he stared and stared and then he just burst into tears. And he said, I've never seen anything so beautiful in my life. And so quite a lot of people were saying like, you know, people would send me emails like from all around the world saying, you don't understand how much we were tortured, how much family members were killed. My uncle had his toenails pulled out. Like we suffered beyond what money is worth so that we can achieve this. And it wasn't actually the big accolades. It wasn't me standing in front of 7 million people. Honestly, I felt awesome. I felt awesome that our ancestors will be looking on this day saying all of what we did was worth it. I felt proud for them, not for myself, but for me, it was those intimate one-on-one moments where people would share their stories with me and say, do you know that I got my mouth washed out with soap every day for speaking this language, even though I couldn't speak any other one? That's how I learnt the language of the country. So for me, it was those sharing those stories of people impacting, grown men, old women. Like an old woman saw one of my pictures and she cried. She's like, this is so beautiful. And then she grabbed it and taught her children, this is my culture. This is where I'm from. This is what we grew up with. And it just opened this intergenerational conversation, which I thought was so powerful.
Allahu Akbar, mashallah. Isn't that amazing that how we feel so proud, not of ourselves, but subhanAllah, of the change we are part of. And change is the hardest thing in this world, subhanAllah, that we know there's change management people out there.
Yep.
But subhanAllah, like when we change other people's lives and we affect them to the better, it makes us feel alive. I don't think there's anything
it's an
more
addictive
beautiful.
feeling, isn't it?
More
Yeah.
beautiful. Did that honestly motivate you to do more?
That's when I knew I was on the right path. It feels like, oh yeah, that's good. I still would have gone on with it, but that very visceral reaction, my dad never cries. I don't think I've ever seen him cry in my life. So when I saw that, I was like, oh, okay, I'm onto something. And then again, I made this 1 5-minute clip, and I'm going to talk money because, you know, back in the day it was big money for me. But I met these men and they did videos, and I said, I want you to tell my story in 4 or 5 minutes because I want to use it for fundraising. And they said $5,000. And I was like, what? I can't even count to 5,000. And so they said, how much do you want to raise? I said, 50. Like, what if this $5,000 video made you 50 grand? Wouldn't it be worth it? I thought, he's such a good salesman. So I paid the 5,000. And I remember the first person, and I'll protect this person's confidentiality, but the first person I showed it to was an Oromo person, someone who I respect. And that person when I say howling, they were howling with tears. They just cried and cried and cried, and they just wouldn't stop crying.
Wow.
And they said, like, our stories have never been spoken. Our stories have never been put in a beautiful light. And the products that I make reflect our people beautifully. Like, it's made for us by us. And so, again, it was those intimate one-on-one reactions of people that I respected that I was like, okay, this is a sign from Allah. I'm just a vessel. To be honest, my Oromo wasn't. It's getting better now because I've done thousands of interviews. I can get up and speak because there's a different, like even Arabic. There's a different Arabic for conversation.
That's
There's
right.
a different Arabic for interviews and for giving speeches to people. So I was okay with the conversational stuff, not with the others. But I think there was something about my story that people related to. They wanted me to go on news and speak casually.
SubhanAllah.
And so because I had, the luxury of making mistakes, that improved my confidence. And that's something that I live my life by now. Let my kids make mistakes. Let people make mistakes. They learn that way. Like, they really do.
Ameen. And subhanAllah, you were on the project as well. So that was one of the...
Yeah, they documented my story. So when I went back, the project documented basically what happened from the start to the very end. And at the time, they said, who do you want to meet? And I said, the Minister of Education. That's who I want to talk to. And I went to see the Minister of Education. He said, I've never seen anything like this in my life. Never. He's like, I'm the Minister of Education, not in our history. We need to work together. And I remember asking, like, how many students are we dealing with? And he's like, well, what's your specialty? I said, well, elementary, so grade 1 to grade 4. And so they whipped out all their Excel documents and everything. That 1.3 million students registered in Oromo state schools across the country.
Oh, wow.
And it's like, that's who, they went into civil war after that. So it became really difficult. But like, that showed me also, Toltu, you get to your journey and then you leave it. Like, if it goes on, it goes on. But if it doesn't, so I don't have a dream now to, produce all my books for children. Now I'm more interested in the people who are interested, which is like, Oromo is a second language, parents from overseas. It doesn't have to be in Ethiopia for me anymore.
Amazing. Awesome. Maybe since we started on a high note, take us on a dark moment. What would you say your hardest moment in your life?
They say behind every really successful woman is a very, very dark time that she overcame and went through. And I think for me, so I have been Islamically married twice and divorced. And so I remember the first time I had a divorce, and I can come on a public space and be like, did you know my ex? And just trash them out because I've got a microphone here and they don't. So I think it's a really tricky space to be in. But what I have genuinely, what happened, so after the first time, so when I got divorced, in my mind, I did everything right. Like, I was the good Muslim girl. I did nothing wrong. I didn't have boyfriends. I didn't go out and drink alcohol. How could this possibly happen to me? And my dad said, listen, it's like marriage is sunnah. It's like divorce is from Allah. Why are you worried about you getting divorced? He's like, if it was haram, it wouldn't be permissible. He's like, your value doesn't go down for something that Allah has given.
Ameen.
Allah never sent down a surah talking about marriage. He sent down a surah about talaq because he cares for you and he protects you. So go and read the surah. And then when I read that surah, I was like, there was one particular A in there that says, for, the women, that Allah will give to the woman from places she never imagined.
Allah.
And I was devastated. I was like, what do you mean never imagined? Oh my God, my life's over. No one's ever going to want to marry me again. And then within 3 months of that, Afaan was born. Afaan Publications was born. I was going to do it when I was married, but I'm like, just never got around to it. But in that heartbreak, I sat down and and Dad gave me money too. He was like, I'm going to give you some money to help you. Just be busy, do something. And then that's what I did.
Wow.
So that was a very, very dark time, but it was also like on the cusp of an amazing thing that was about to happen. And the same thing then I got, married again and I had 2 children. And then, that marriage didn't, ended in divorce also. And then there was a part of me, I was like, I don't want to be that woman who's had 2 divorces. Like how people
It's all
struggle
your
with,
fault.
That's it. I'm like, Steve, she couldn't live with 2 men. How could you? And it's funny because then my community was supportive. They were like, these things happen. You can marry 10 men if you need to. Why are you so stressed about it? You've done great things. You've done wonderful things. You've led our community. We know that you're an amazing woman. And that doesn't necessarily pass judgment, on the father of my children per se. But I think what I learnt from myself in that, people ask like, why did your marriage break up? Like, what was so bad about it? And honestly, if I think about it, like I said, I can be like, he did that. But marriage is also a dynamic. And so I realized in myself, I started to become okay with things that were not okay.
Yeah.
And sometimes when we sit in that place, which is very different to sabr, patience is very different, which is, when you're on the right path and you stand in your truth, for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then you hold on to whatever happens.
Amen.
But when you start being okay with things that are not okay, when you start taking other people's words and things to live and guide your life, it is a one-way ticket to a really bad marriage.
I've had this discussion before. ولا تتخاف الميزان. And the reality is we see that a lot, subhanAllah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, do not take anybody's hat, but do not allow anybody else to take your hat. And subhanAllah, as good Muslims, we see a lot of brothers and sisters, and this is when things, subhanAllah, fall apart in relationships.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about only friendships and marriages.
Yeah, marriages too.
It's only when you give up your hat. And that's what Muslims do. They give up their hat. And Allah
Thinking
subhanahu wa
it's
ta'ala
sadaqah.
everything is a good thing to do, but that's not right. لا تدخل في الميزان. Do not allow this equilibrium to get out of whack.
Yep.
You know?
Because if as a woman you're asking for your rights in Islam, do you know what that means? It means if you're not getting it, you're being oppressed. If a woman needs to ask for her rights, something's really wrong. Shouldn't even be asking for them, because that's when we're at like the lowest common denominator. So, that was a very dark time for me. Obviously, it was very difficult, like the whole marriage situation. But for me personally, it was a journey of self-discovery of like, who am I? What am I doing? Who am I living for? For others or for myself or for the sake of Allah? And I think that was another journey that brought me onto the successes that I've had outside of Afaan. So like at the moment, I'm living my best life. I'm so happy right now. And I wish, goodness for everyone, but that's the journey. And I think sometimes women need to hear that.
Ameen.
Because we're constantly being taught like, you must do this, you must do that we don't even educate ourselves on who we are and what we need. We can't even stand in our own truth because we don't know what our truth is. And, that's something I like to share about me so that people, learn to value themselves.
What advice would you give us men?
Advice to you men?
Yes, for marriage, keeping a good marriage.
Well, I feel like both of you are in a marriage, so I'm curious to hear from you. What's been the one thing that's kept your marriage going?
She's throwing back the interview. No speak English.
No speaking.
Look, I think I think generally when people ask me for advice around marriage, it's different advice for men and for women, but the overall advice would be you need to understand that marriage is half of your faith, which means half is you and half is the marriage. You need to do work on both.
Yeah.
So what happens in a lot of marriages is that husband and wife will get married and he talks about all his hopes and dreams and she's like, yes, we're going to do what he wants. And then what she does is she ignores herself and then gives 100% into the marriage. And so the marriage grows and he grows and she doesn't. And then she ends up being really resentful. I did this for you, blah, blah, I'm not happy. The opposite is also true where it's like, don't tell me what to do. I'm going to work on myself. And then the marriage doesn't grow and then it disintegrates and falls apart. And so it's like a level 1 and level 2. Yeah. So when I talk to people about getting married, make sure it's something where you can work on yourself and also work on the marriage as well. So that, and the other one is communication. That's a huge one.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Because we talk different languages.
Well, you know what? I mean...
Can I ask before that?
Yeah.
Were both husbands what nationality?
They were from my dad's. They were
Oh
both
my
Oromo.
God.
I know.
You should have went for a Turk.
I believe me, I've been advised. Like, have you considered trying another one, like a different by any chance? But, Allahu Alam, that's in, Allah's plan for me and my life. And I think what's really important to me now was that if I was to go back, into another relationship, that I would be thinking about exactly what I said to you. Working on yourself and working on your marriage in a way where it complements each other, where you're not being made to feel you're inadequate or you're too much or you're selfish. Your dreams are your dreams and you should definitely aspire to them. And then when things fall apart, communication helps. And these are things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has in all of his surahs and all of the stories that we hear.
It goes back to subhanAllah, we do that at the retreat, which is growth and contribution. Growth and contribution. If one is growing and contributing only, the other one isn't, they fall by the wayside. And subhanAllah, it's all about growth and contribution. And I say in relationships, there has to be an equilibrium of growth and contribution where you can grow and contribute yourself and so is the other partner, because they don't have to both contribute and grow in the same way as well.
All at the same time.
At the same time. You know what I mean? There's subhanAllah, I think that's one thing that I think is so powerful. Growth and contribution is the key to fulfilling relationships, I believe, anyway.
I think, which also speaks to a more bigger thing about the difference between rights and responsibilities. And so sometimes I think as Muslims that gets conflated. What are my rights? Like, of course you have rights, but even human rights have responsibilities attached to them. Humans have a right to live, but they have a responsibility to, contribute to staying alive, to taking from what's there. 100%. So, it's important for us to use our rights and our responsibilities, growth and contributing, level 1, level 2. It all comes together. What a great way to bring it all together.
Amen. May Allah bless you, subhanAllah. It's mashallah, amazing getting to know you on the podcast.
Thank you.
We've met a couple of times, but we've never had these deep and meaning conversation, mashallah.
We've seen you at Benny Kids. At
Benevolence.
And mashallah.
SubhanAllah. And it's amazing, mashallah. We've known about your story and how much you've done in the community. May Allah bless you and inshallah elevate you in the dunya and in the akhirah, inshallah. And whatever's khair for you, may it come, inshallah. Mashallah, you've got a beautiful story. We always like to end the podcast on this I am statement. We ask our guests to describe themselves in a single I am statement, but I'll let you think about that for now.
I have the answer.
I'll let you think about it because I've got to do something before that. But before that, I'd like to before we end the podcast and get your statement, we would like to thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first and foremost for allowing us to do this. Our audience, of course, for watching. Alhamdulillah, we are so blessed. We have gone international. Our viewership is, alhamdulillah, blowing up and we're very, very excited and very thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and our audience for watching, alhamdulillah. And again, we're going to remind you guys to please subscribe, like, share, and comment. We'd love your questions. SubhanAllah, we're getting a lot of commentary and questions that we're passing on to our guests. Alhamdulillah, trying to get their feedback for you guys. And on that bombshell, we'd like to know your I am statement, a single sentence.
I am Toltu, and my name is an emotion, and it means content or satisfied.
Allahu Akbar. MashaAllah. There you
I
go.
am Toltu.
A person that knows themselves knows everything, and the person that doesn't know themselves, SubhanAllah. It's amazing how you got that ready and you know yourself, SubhanAllah. May Allah bless you. Jazakallah khair for sharing your beautiful story and your journey. And inshallah, we'll have you again further down the track where you
just specific on that last topic.
Yes, definitely. That is blowing up in the Muslim community. People, no one's been doing it right. I feel that I can say with confidence.
I think we have to go chat about that. I think specifically because it's very powerful. Jazakallah khair. And I'd like to remind everybody, she's got a podcast herself. So
I do.
Inshallah, we'll put a link on it for you. And if you'd like anyone to find out about you, you've got your own website as well.
Toltu.com, Instagram.
So amazing sister. So Allah bless her. Jazakumullah khair. Thank you everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.